All right, you're welcome back to the AM show, and my name is Israel, and I'm here with Enimwa Enimado, and we're going to be talking about vaccinations. So you know, government has received, 177,000 doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccines, and we're looking out for when this will be, rolled out so that the rest of the population, well, virtually everybody, because we have just about less than 500,000 people having been vaccinated doubly. I mean, given the double jab of AstraZeneca. So if we have this, it's good news. We want to know how it's going to be rolled out. But before we get into the conversation, let's get to find out what the status of COVID cases is.
Okay. So we have 6,969 active cases. Remember that we peaked at almost 8,000 during the second wave. And we have 409 new cases. And we saw in the newspapers this morning that we've had 9 deaths in the past few days. So it brings a cumulative total to 108,226 cases with 874 deaths. But Israel, let's have a conversation with Dr. Kwame Amponsa Achiano, who is the program manager for the expanded program on immunization.
Yes, good morning to you, Dr. Achiano.
Yeah, good morning. Please, your voice is a bit low. I can hardly hear, please.
All right, Dr. Achiano, can you hear me now? Is it any better?
Let's manage it, sir. Okay. I have a lot of calls waiting.
All right, great. So I just want us to go straight to the Johnson & Johnson vaccines that have come in. What's the plan for the rollout? Who's going to get it when?
Yeah, so within the week, we'll conclude by midweek, we'll conclude the final plan. We will still go according to the vulnerable population in terms of hotspots and also those who are hardest hit.
All right, so is it going to be based just in Accra, or it's going to be all over the country?
Oh, it will be difficult to spread 177,000 doses thinly across board. It won't use any effect. So we are just looking at a couple of places. Otherwise, it will not be effective.
So a couple of places are saying greater
within the hotspots.
Within the hotspots?
Yes.
Right. So it's obvious that there were a number of people who had the first dose of the AstraZeneca.
That is right.
Okay, but they won't be giving this dose.
No.
We can't combine the two.
No, we still haven't changed the policy of... But remember, Johnson & Johnson is one dose, the one dose schedule.
Yes.
For the others, they are 2 dose schedule. And so anybody who received AstraZeneca will receive AstraZeneca second dose. And we are working around the clock together. So in our estimation, before the end of the month, we would have received some AstraZeneca for those who will need who require the second dose. So that shouldn't panic at all.
So the other challenge is that with the Johnson & Johnson, we're supposed to have a particular cold chain system in place. Do we have that for the
That is not quite right. What is right is that Johnson & Johnson requires the ordinary cold chain.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right.
You probably are talking about Pfizer. That's a different thing.
All right. So we're ready to roll this out without any...
Yeah, we don't have any issues with cold chain at all. It's just like AstraZeneca.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And we'll be expecting to hear from the Ghana Health Service, as you indicated, sometime during the week, right?
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you too. So that's Dr. Achiano, is the program manager, expanded program on immunization. Indeed, it's good news. We've been waiting for this for a while. There are 2 things that we can do, or one of the things we can do to stop COVID, to fight COVID, is the vaccine. But before we get the vaccine, so in the meantime that we don't have the vaccines, what we're encouraged to do is to go with the preventive protocols, which is the masking, washing of hands, social distancing, and all of that. So yes, it's good news that we have it, but then the other conversation we're going to have has to do with, attempts to acquire some more vaccines, which is Sputnik V.
Yes.
So we set out to want to get the Sputnik V, and the officials say it's been difficult getting the Sputnik V. So we had to resort to going through a middleman. And we had to pay some monies, except we didn't get all the vaccines, or we just got a fraction of the vaccines. So now the parliamentary committee looked into it, and they found out that we would have to return. We have paid for monies for the vaccines that we never got, and so we're looking at getting the money back. But that's just not it. The minority in Parliament was hoping that the health minister who was responsible, would be sanctioned of a sort. That didn't happen. So we're going to have a conversation where we're going to look into this whole conversation, the outcome of parliamentary probe. They've submitted their report, and the House was supposed to have taken a vote on it, but that didn't happen. That was deferred
to the next sitting. So interesting stuff. And I think one of the things that stood out from those findings was the minister and the way that he handled it, you know, and saying that he wasn't aware of some of the stuff that had gone on. And obviously there's a lot of there's been a lot of backlash towards him because of that. But we're going to have another conversation about procurement.
Yes. So it has to do still.
It's still on the same thing, yes. It's just,
And one of the issues that's come is the procurement and the way we went about the procurement. Kobna Atabedu is a procurement analyst, and he's joining us right now via Zoom so that we can get into that conversation. Thank you very much, Mr. Atabedu. So there's been a lot of talk about how we've been doing procurement in this country in the first place. And the conversation we're having now has to do with the Sputnik V. We found ourselves in another situation where the procurement hasn't gone the way it should have gone. I'm sure you've been monitoring or following this for a while. What would be your assessment of the state of affairs as far as this Sputnik V attempted procurement is concerned?
Okay. So I'd like to start off by setting a context.
All right.
Now, the context is that there are different kinds of products that would usually be bought by an organization. And the Act 663 is mindful of that, and so made provision for different procurement methods. Now, one of it, and there's a theoretical model we use to place these products and terms the relationships we establish with them or how we approach the market. Now, Sputnik V falls within the category called strategic products. And these are usually products which, amongst other variables, are proprietary in nature. It means you are dealing with intellectual property, and therefore there's a higher supply risk, or there are very few suppliers. In some cases, it's a monopolistic market. So you have to deal with limited suppliers or a single supplier. And that is why the Act makes provision for single sourcing or sole sourcing when the need arises. The Act is also mindful of the fact that there would be emergencies, and an organization or an entity may not be able to go through the normal processes. So it sets out a mechanism for an organization to be able to go through an emergency procurement, part of which includes a ratification of a procurement. So it means you bought something before you are coming to get approval. So a ratification is also allowed, but it is allowed in a context, and the Act sets them up. Now, if you take Sputnik V, if I'm to do an assessment of the supply market, indeed, all the vaccines are proprietary in nature. It means one person has the property rights. You need to deal with that one person to get it. So if you take the fact that government said, or the ministry said that they tried to deal directly with the manufacturers and they couldn't, so they were going to go through a third party. That it's a bit worrisome for me, because if it is a proprietary material, you can only deal with one person. It means whoever you go to as a middleman has to deal with that one person. Now, if you tell me that the owners of the property right have said that deal with specific individuals, That is also worrisome from a corporate governance and from an ethics point of view, because it suggests that, number one, as soon as you have middlemen in, it means each person has a margin or a markup, and it's going to make the product very expensive. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if there's only one source, it means all those middlemen will have to go to that same source. Now the question is, between us or Ghana as a country and an entity, a buying entity, and those middlemen, who has more leverage, who has more credibility or credit risk for the organization to deal with? And as soon as the organization doesn't want to deal with you and is saying go through a middleman, then it suggests there's a problem. And that is why you should be mindful. Now,
Mr. Tabedu, I would also want to bring this up. Aren't there instances where a company will say, indeed, deal with this person, don't come to me directly?
Yes, there are instances where companies may decide for its distribution strategy that we won't do business to customer transactions. Yeah. We'll do to business transactions. So it means we would appoint key distributors or agents or call them middlemen. So you interface with the middlemen.
Yes.
For me, I think this is not one which is or should have been like this. Okay. This is government to government. So bilateral relationships should have sufficed.
Okay, we'll come to that. We have also on the line Kwabena Akando. He's the vice chair of the Sputnik vaccine probe. He's a member of parliament. Thank you very much. Now, from where you stand, I know that the minority in parliament sought to bring up some motion of a sort. Tell us where we are as far as the probe is concerned.
Yeah, thank you very much. The motion was moved that it was a private member motion, moved, debated, and the committee was constituted. We have finished, the committee has finished its work, and we have submitted them to Parliament. We debated it. It was left to the Speaker to put it to vote. Unfortunately, that has been deferred. And so that is where we are at the moment. But in the course of debating the report of the committee, we on the minority side, sought to amend the motion to include censorship, which of course our rules allows us to do that. Order 78D. It is one of the motions you can move without notice. But unfortunately, everything on the report has been deferred.
Now, this censorship motion that you're talking about, how come it didn't come up during the committee sitting so that it would be included in the findings or recommendations?
For me, the understanding of the mandate we were given is that it is an ad hoc committee,
all right,
a fact-finding committee. And so my understanding is that we should, find the witness on point of law. And for example, he breached Article 1815. He breached the procurement by list the sections and all that. But we were not supposed to make definite pronouncement or be judgmental. And so the rest will lie with the plenary. The rest will lie with Parliament to take that particular decision. That is my understanding.
Let's look at some of the key recommendations that came out of the committee's work.
Well, if you have time, then probably we may have to take it one after the other. We may have to take it the terms of reference that we were given. So, for example, number one, we're supposed to determine whether or not the transactions were of international nature, and if they were, whether Article 1815 was fulfilled. And clearly, per the nature and address of Al Maktoum, we realize that the transaction between the Republic of Ghana and Al Maktoum was of international nature, and therefore the minister ought to have come to Parliament for prior approval.
All right.
Unfortunately, that didn't happen. We also requested to know whether or not the AG's advice was sought on this particular matter. Interestingly, the minister signed or executed the contract before resorting to AG for their advice. So what it means is that the advice of the AG was immaterial. It had no effect on the contract because the contract had already been executed. But after that, the AG wrote back to the ministry, indicating to them that they should have come to Parliament for the prior approval of Parliament before that contract will be valid. So that term of preference, the minister violated that one. Then we're also to determine whether procurement processes were followed and the propriety of sale. You realize that the minister said he did what you call sole sourcing or sole source procurement.
Yeah.
And if you go to the Public Procurement Act, those specific provisions that allow the minister to do sole sourcing means that you must satisfy Section 41 and Section 42. 41, you must come with public notification, and then you must also have the prior approval of the Public Procurement Authority. Unfortunately, the minister signed the contract somewhere in March, 9th March, and after a month later, somewhere in April, then he wrote to the Public Procurement Authority to ratify the agreement for them. Then the Public Procurement Authority wrote back to the minister that they want to investigate him because he needed a prior approval from them, but he didn't do that. But so they want to investigate him. So in fact, as we speak, the agreement hasn't been ratified by the PPA. And so clearly, the procurement laws of this country were breached. Then we go to ascertain the cost of the vaccine and whether or not there was value for money. So that on that point too, we realized that the factory, Sputnik, the manufacturers of Sputnik V, had communicated to the whole world that the international market price per dose should not be more than $10. So we took it from that, and the minister said, yes, he was aware. We also went further to find out whether he saw nothing wrong with it. He said, yes, he saw everything wrong, and he thought that it was on the higher side. But that was what his negotiation could afford him.
All right.
So clearly, that one too, it was on the higher side. Now, let's move to another interesting one. Whether or not there was some consideration that has passed to the middlemen, we'll come to whether or not there were middlemen involved. We'll come to that aspect. But let's look at whether or not there was some money paid. In fact, all along when we started, some of us were abused, were called names that, oh, after all, why are you doing this? Because Ghana has not lost any money and all that. So the minister appeared before us, and he said categorically that Ghana has not paid any money as far as he was concerned. We've not paid any money to the suppliers. So we wrote to the Ministry of Finance whether or not no money or no consideration has passed. But remember that in the course of that, there was the mid-year review budget. And in the mid-year review budget, if you go to releases, we saw that more than 16, in fact, about 16.330640, $16.3 million Ghana cedis had been paid. But you see, we took the hint from the LC that Ghana government issued to Al Maktoum. On the LC, one of the conditions was that they should pay 50% of the money before even they start the delivery.
Okay, so Mr. Akando, I'd want you to hold on at this point, and I'll bring in Kwabena Atabedu on the issue of the letter of credit. Is it regular that you issue letters of credit and you're supposed to pay, what, 50%? My understanding of this is you deliver, It is when you deliver that
Fantastic.
you're paid for whatever you have delivered. Mr. Tabedu.
Credit are payment instruments, and they are subject to the terms that are set out by the parties. So if the seller feels that my risk is higher, so I want security, you say, give me a letter of credit. He can say that, give me a letter of credit for 50% of the amount or 100% of the amount. The buyer now decides that if I give you the money and I'm not sure I'll get my products, so I would also set the conditions that, for example, I would only release the money to you when I have received documentation that shows that the goods are out of your hands. In that case, the intermediary banks become the middlemen. The money is issued out of my account as a buyer, and it goes into an escrow. Once the documents are delivered to my bank and we are satisfied with the terms, then the money goes to you and I get it. So it is inflexible, but it is flexible in that sense that you can decide to do 50%. So if an advance payment, which in the context of an emergency where demand is higher than supplier, the supplier has more leverage, so he can call more shots. So it is possible for the buyer to say that, yes, give me 50% upfront in the form of an LC. So he's guaranteed that he's getting 50% of his money before he will ship the goods. So it is possible.
Okay, so this is, it happens in this kind of business.
Yes, it can happen.
Let me bring in Adama Sena, who is an anti-graft campaigner. Thank you very much, Mr. Sena. So what are your observations as far as this whole deal is concerned, the Sputnik V procurement?
Well, it's quite unfortunate that we found ourselves where we are today. When I was listening to the minister responding, I felt that, thank God we've not paid any money. I was intrigued that, okay, so the Attorney General had given him advice. He said he was confused. He said, well, sometimes that might happen. But the findings of this committee, I mean, it's like reality has just hit. So much seems to have gone wrong, and I'm quite disturbed. I don't know how we managed to put aside all the procedures as much as followed, the fact that it's an international contract, you must seek parliamentary approval, the fact that there's a PPA, all the checks and balances that will allow us to get value for money and ensure that the public purse is not just expended anyhow, seem to have been ignored. And it's shocking to identify that this is how far wrong that the ministry went.
Well, the minister has been explaining. He says, he was under a lot of pressure. He was eager to get the vaccines available so that we could vaccinate Ghanaians and protect them from COVID-19.
On the contrary, it's in crisis moments that you need to be the most sober, most alert, that you need to do good consultation. And the evidence suggests that those who were available to give him good advice did so. And so now that issue of confusion, I mean, given the fact that the Attorney General had spoken, given the fact that PPA had raised certain issues, given the fact that money was actually transferred, it's not looking good at all.
What are your suspicions?
I actually don't have any suspicions. I just think that the minister ignored what was good practice, best practice. I think that for all you know, he may have had some people closer to him who said, look, just go ahead, etc. And this is a risk you run when you do things like that, because it really doesn't make sense that the formal opportunities to get advice on this were sought, the advice was provided, and you ignored it. And with middlemen involved, obviously, even if the minister and his group were not making any money of it, somebody somewhere was making money off it. And those are the points at which one should have been much more cautious.
And to this point, Israel, let me add this. You see, there was a case in between 2005 and 2007 in Nigeria, which had to do with one of the oil companies and the issue of graft. And they used middlemen to engage, address certain transactions. Now, when they were being found guilty, One of the things that the court said was that they were in a position to have known that any payments they made through the middleman were going to go to inappropriate payments. And these are some of the things that when you are doing corporate governance or ethical assessments for fraud, anti-corruption, and all these things, those are some of the tests you put through it. That's why I started off by saying that as soon as the seller says that I don't want to deal with you, in a situation where the transaction can and should have been a government-to-government transaction, then your antennas should be very high, and you should be very suspect of what could go wrong within the areas of corporate governance and ethical issues.
All right, now I want to bring in Kwabena Akando, the vice chair of the Sputnik V Probe, again. So what you have recommended is that we have some 16.3 million cedis that has been paid to...
Who am I speaking to? Who am I?
This is Israel.
Israel, before we go there,
yeah,
allow me to tell you something about the payment. In fact, everything about the payment of 16.330640 was abnormal.
Why do you say that?
Exactly. Number one, take note that it takes the Ministry of Health to request for the issue of the LC. So you cannot tell me that you are not aware when some money has been paid. That's number one. Number two, when the money was paid, actually paid, it was paid on the 31st of March. The contract was signed on 9th March. The money was paid on 31st of March, and letter was written to Bank of Ghana from controller, and the first person they copied a letter to was and is the minister responsible for health. That we have paid so and so amount since 31st of March.
All right.
You understand? Number two, it is quite dramatical, and for me, I have a lot of doubts, but I'll share them for now. You know what? When proceedings was ongoing, the committee was constituted on the 9th of July. The minister appeared on the 15th of July. Then on the 14th of July, a letter dated 14th of July was submitted to the committee that Al Maktoum has put out of the contract. This is right. Note this carefully. In the third letter, no mention was made to the effect that some money has been paid to Al Maktoum. Don't forget that already the minister has appeared before the committee and indicated no money has been paid. So what was going on? Let's take that one aside about the payment. Now, the minister responsible for finance is supposed to protect the public purse. For me, and forgive me if my words are harsh, for me, as I sit here, the most treacherous person to our public purse is the minister responsible for finance. And I say so because Israel. Now, a minister responsible for finance don't just get up and anybody can say, I've contracted this person, so go and pay, then you also go and pay. It is on record that this contract didn't go through cabinet. This contract didn't come to parliament. This contract didn't go through the appropriate procurement procedure. So upon what basis did the minister responsible for finance pay this money?
In other words, from what you're saying, I get the understanding that you wish that you had the finance minister also appear before the committee to answer questions.
Fantastic. In fact, we wrote to the finance committee, and given the time we're given, we took delivery of the responses, and we had to prepare our reports quickly and then submit and all that. But for me, the finance minister has a lot of questions to answer. Because how many of such payments has he done that we are not aware of? Because it has come to light that anybody at all can get up and go to the ministry and say, look, I have engaged this person to go and pay. Then they will also go and pay. Because the necessary procedures that must be followed before this payment should be done were not followed. So everything about the payment was bizarre, to say the least.
Okay, so in this instance, you're looking at the health minister, you're looking at the finance minister. Is there anybody else in the chain that you think that has questions to answer?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to international contract of this nature, yes, the finance minister, the PPA, the
PPA
AG,
says they didn't ratify.
Of course. I'm just mentioning them. Then those that we have cleared so far.
Okay.
Yes. So PPA, FDA, Finance, Ministry of Health. But the minister made it clear that he didn't involve FDA, so it's useless if you invite them.
All right.
And the PPA too, clearly per the evidence, they also have, they themselves have even issues with the contract. And so the minister responsible for finance, at least, as for the AG, they wrote to them after the contract had been executed, and then they also gave them the advice they should follow, and they didn't. So for me, as far as I'm concerned, up to this point, the Ministry of Finance, especially the minister responsible for finance, has a lot of questions to answer.
Now, how do we get this money back? You said the finance minister has been ordered to retrieve it. What are the chances we're going to get this money?
Well, I can assure you, Israel, that I am going to follow this money till evidence of refund is shown to Parliament. It's not as if you are just going to tell us that, oh, it's been paid and that's the end. No, because we've heard about, issues about the fact that Ghana has not lost any money and all that, and we are at where we are at the moment. And so I will continue to pursue this issue till this money is actually refunded to the state.
All right, I'll come back to you in a bit for you to tell us about the let's finalize the recommendations, but I want to bring on Kwabena Tebedu. Kwabena, what are the chances we're going to get this money, $16.3 million?
Okay, so first question is that there's an agreement, so we are in contract management mode. What were the terms and conditions of those contracts? Now, if Ahmad Maktouk or the Sheikh, whatever his name is, the Sheikh, if he pulled out of the contract, what are the liabilities that should inure to the state? You can't just pull out of a contract. So if he decides to pull out, what were the liquidated damages, or what are the remedies available to state, and to what extent have we pursued those remedies? That's the first point, especially when consideration had passed, money had gone. The second one is that I listened to Mr. Akando, and he was talking about the Minister of Health and the Minister of Finance. Yes, they hold ultimate responsibility as the politicians. But for God's sake, there are technical people behind them who know their job, who should be advising them on the bureaucracy and how to handle it. Where are those people? Those people should be responsible. Actually, they should be whipped in this, not the ministers. The ministers will take ultimate responsibility. But there were technical people, and these are the people who are not doing Ghana any good.
Still,
as to being able to retrieve the money, yes, we've paid money. It hasn't been supplied. It is part of the processes. If you are pulling out out of a contract, once termination triggers, there are actions that follow with termination. Part of it is recovering all assets from the other part. Our money is part of the assets, and we should be able to recover it. But you see, it depends on how the contract was structured. And I have seen a number of government contracts with third parties, which are very weak.
Okay, what are your fears? Is it the case that, or are you worried we probably may not get the money back because of the way we structured the contract?
We may end up chasing rabbits through their holes, and it will not come back unless we are ready to go through the international courts to pursue and collect it, which we must.
Now, Adama Sena, what's your feeling about all of this? Does it look likely that this money is going to come?
Well, I think that Kwabena has pointed out the risks we run. If you don't have liability clauses that clearly spell out what will happen if there is a problem, and we did this through intermediaries who may have forwarded monies to other quarters and people, the money trail, it could be a very complicated task. And that's the unfortunate thing, because you see, if they'd followed process, the eventual contract would have been reviewed by the AGs that have the institutional memory to say, look, we know what it takes to have a solid contract that protects the interests of this country. All in all, it's not looking good for the minister, nor is it looking good for the people who did the technical work around this. Indeed, I agree with Kwabena that if we want to truly learn lessons for the future, this is one time where I would like a situation where we should dig into the internal processes. And so who was the one who was eventually responsible for this contract and advised that it could proceed? It should not be left at the position of the minister, because that's where we keep repeating this. But when we begin to get into the technocrats and make sure that people are held accountable, people are sanctioned, we will prevent a situation where often, and sometimes we could even have an internal mafia who intentionally influence this whole thing at the expense of the minister. I mean, these guys have become
set up
very
the minister?
Smart. Look, these guys have become smart. Sometimes it's the minister, they know what the political environment is like. You are appointed today. They understand their ecosystem. They take advantage of them sometimes. So let's not just leave it at the level of the minister, as Kwabena has said. I think we should dig deeper if we want to make inroads and make sure that we set precedents that last for the future.
All right, I want to bring in Kwabena Mintakano, the vice chair of the Sputnik Probe. And all right, so we just lost him. But I'll put it to the two of you. What do we do? Or what is it that we should do to actually send the message that we're not going to tolerate this again, and so that we don't have this happening?
Okay, so first thing is that this should not end with a minister of health losing his job.
All right.
It shouldn't end with that. Otherwise,
and
we don't
probably
learn
the
the
finance
lesson.
minister also being made to answer questions.
Yes, it shouldn't end. If whatever will happen, it shouldn't end with that. We should go down the line. See, there's nothing that can go out of a ministry without the chief director. If the chief director signs, it can go through the bureaucracy without the minister knowing. So if we dig deeper, we can find out that it is possible that the minister was blindsided. So if he was blindsided, who pushed within to get it to go? So once we go the next level down the minister's level, we will find out the technical people. We learned lessons from this when the Malam Issa thing came about. Because throughout the Malam Issa process, he was insisting that the people sabotaged him. So you can't rule that possibility out. And it is time. Again, whether it is an emergency or not, in situations like this, there is always a committee, a project team that was formed. How was the project team formed? Who were the members of the project team who drove this? How was the stakeholder mapping done to identify that we need this person to make an input at this point? We bring the person in, either as a core team member or as a support. So we have systems available that we could have used that it is obvious we didn't use. That is why some people were not involved or were kind of blindsided. But it shouldn't end with a few people losing their jobs. It should go further down the line. And an example be made of all of them.
I have the vice chair of the committee. He's back on the line now. So thank you very much. We lost you at a point, but the question I want to put to you, and which Kwabena Attabedu has raised. He says that we shouldn't just go after the ministers involved, which is the health minister and then possibly the finance minister, but we should go behind them and find the technocrats or the chief director, the civil servants who were behind. Is this something that you would want to look into, or you suggest that the Parliament looks into?
Well, let me give you this information that the minister responsible for health appeared before the committee with his technocrats. The lawyers were there, the chief director was there, the man in charge of procurement was also there, so they were all before us. I think that as politicians and as leaders, we must also always be very careful about whatever we sign, because don't forget that the ultimate responsibility will lie with you. Because, as you say, the technical men will not have their signature under the document. And let me also be fair with them. we can only probably bring them in if and only if they were involved in the whole transaction. And what's the guarantee that they were involved? But even Cabinet was not involved. Even Cabinet was not involved. PPA was not involved. FDA was not involved. You see, sometimes let's face reality. It is very difficult for the technical guys in the ministry to come out and say that we were not involved whilst they are still working with a person. This is difficult. Sometimes they will even have to pretend to be defending the issue. Because I witnessed a scenario like that at a committee when we were talking about Sputnik V, and when Sputnik V was the product under consideration in the agreement, some of the technical directors were talking about Sputnik Light, which were two completely different products altogether. So yes, I agree to some extent that the technical people can also be questioned. We took our time to question all of them. We asked the counsel for the ministry why he didn't advise the minister and all that. But the reality is that sometimes the technical men in the ministries are also sidelined. If a whole parliament could be sidelined, if the FDA, who could give technical advice on issues of product, and don't forget that vaccines are not just like any commodity like tomatoes where anybody at all can get up and go and steal or sell. We need high protection as far as vaccines are concerned. Look, Israel, let me give you this simple scenario. You remember when they said they were finding it difficult to deal with, government to government?
Yeah,
then,
the Russian authorities.
Exactly. Myself and my colleague, Honorable Kudeta Blakwa, went to the Russian embassy. And we had a lengthy discussions with the ambassador and his officials. Okay? I mean, because of diplomacy, there are a lot of things we cannot say out there. But I can tell you on authority that whatever they put out before the committee was constituted were all false. And in fact...
But your conversations with the diplomats, the Russian ambassador, didn't yield any vaccines, did it?
We didn't go there to go and procure vaccines. That's not what we went there to do.
Yeah, but the minister says he reached out to the foreign affairs minister. They reached out to the authorities. They couldn't get the vaccines.
No, what he said was that they had engaged the deputy ambassador for Russia in the first place, if you recall, and you can probably go back and play all these. Or you can also refer to one of their press release. It is placed there, which of course we don't even have anybody like the deputy ambassador at the Russian embassy. It doesn't even exist. You understand? It doesn't even exist. And their own exhibit and evidences that were provided to the committee shows that expression of interest to buy Sputnik V from Russia began way after signing this contract. Somewhere in later part of April, when we had already signed the contract on 9th March. You know, so they were all forced. And I can tell you on authority that the Russians were ever ready to assist us to get vaccines. Look, isn't it not interesting? When the Sputnik Light, okay, one of their products, the manufacturers of Sputnik V, they came to Ghana and they are still in Ghana doing clinical trials for one of their products, and we have not taken it upon ourselves. We couldn't take it upon ourselves to even negotiate with them to get that vaccines while they are using our country for clinical trials. Who will believe this? They are here. They went through FDA. They went through our institutions. But the minister was telling us that, look, they embarked on some government-to-government transactions and bilateral conversations, and it didn't work. He also started COVAX. If you listen to him in the video, he said, everything was ready. We're going to get some consignment from COVAX, but because of the severe wave in India, they banned exportation of vaccines. So that is why we had to run and go and look for other private or middlemen to engage. But that is false. We signed this agreement on the 9th of March. You know when the severe or the second wave of India they had it in their country. India experienced that severe wave on the 16th of March. They banned the exportation of AstraZeneca on the 25th of March. Meanwhile, you had already signed all these contracts.
Now, one final issue I'd want us to look at. We're talking about the technocrats. And you were saying that you brought them before the committee to question them. In your questioning of the technocrats, did you get the impression that they were not aware of the deal? Because
for
you're
me,
saying sometimes
to be
they were
very,
not.
very frank with you,
Yeah.
I realized that they didn't even understand the whole thing. When we are talking about
what was it that they
Sputnik V,
didn't understand? They were
because
brought.
I have already told you, if you were listening, Israel, I'm telling you that when the product and the concentration in the agreement was Sputnik V, they were talking about Sputnik Light. They were talking about Sputnik Light. In fact, when we even asked them about the background of the company they had engaged, they were trying to tell us the background. Do you know that the Akmatum has no background when it comes to pharmaceutical trade? No background. Go and check. So for me, I was struggling to.
So essentially, you would absolve the technical guys.
Well, not yet, especially in the Ministry of Finance, because if you look at the letter, Deputy Minister of so and so was copied. A person, I don't have a copy in front of me. I would have read it out to you. I don't have it in front of me now. So I would have absorbed them completely. But hey, hasten slowly. Let's find out whether or not they were involved. If they were involved, fine, you have every right to blame them because that is their responsibility. But I'm telling you that the realities on the ground are sometimes such that they may not even be aware of the contract.
All right.
Look, let me tell you this. Are you aware that even before this agreement was signed, we have something we call the emergency authorization. So every vaccine, we have a company that is in charge of, that goes for the emergency use authorization in every country. As far as Sputnik V is concerned, the company that has a license for the emergency use authorization had requested to offer Ghana some doses of vaccines and at a much, much, much lower price. But that was ignored. And we went into our Maktoum and SL Global Agreement. So there are complex questions.
All right.
There are a lot of questions that need to be answered.
And you say that you're going to pursue this. What's going to be your next line of action?
My next line of action now, when we're debating the report on the floor of the House, our leaders sought to amend the motion to include censorship. The question has been deferred. Probably will continue when we resume. But the point is that I'm going to follow up with a parliamentary question to make sure that we have evidence to the effect that the money has really been refunded to the state and other issues. So we will. It's unfortunately that is my job. I'm the ranking member on the committee. Yeah. So yes, whether you like it or you don't like it, I must also live up to expectation. So we will do our best.
All right. Thank you very much, Kwabena Minta Akando. He is the vice chair of the Sputnik Vaccine Probe. But I still have on the line Kwabena Tabedu, who's a procurement analyst, and Adama Sena. Let's. I'll just hope that we're going to be getting this money, Kwabena Tabedu and Adama Sena. And that, well, in addition to that, you're suggesting that we should also go after not just the ministers, but we should also go after the technocrats.
Yes, in spite of Mr. Kando's his take, his observations that they didn't even seem to have enough knowledge about the Sputnik V and they didn't seem to know the company, etc. I think it is worth our while doing that additional investigation. What is the paper trail supporting the contracts, etc.? I mean, if you're in any other jurisdiction, they would have demanded the emails and the approval letters. So you have a chain of everything, which will show every desk on which this landed, the comments they made. Now, that is useful for approval. I mean, approval doesn't happen at a high level. I mean, there's always the supporting documents and people doing work. So a verbal engagement with a group of people may not give you the full picture. And sometimes they can pretend. So I would rather we go the full haul, get the paper trail completely, then draw a firm conclusion. I also know that their report doesn't make any finding on the minister per se. unless I missed it, maybe it's a colleague and they are avoiding saying anything concrete. But I see that as a major gap. We should have had a recommendation that dealt with their colleague as well to show that the House is serious about these issues.
Well, that's what they're saying, that they sought to bring a censure motion. It was deferred, and so to the next sitting.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, Mr. Thank you very much, Adama Sena. Mr. Atabedu.
You're welcome.